In 1958, 20-year-old Ron Walters and his cousin 19-year-old Carol Parks Hahn decided something had to be done about the whites-only lunch counters in Wichita. Both were leaders in the local NAACP Youth Council, where they learned about ways to fight discrimination. Working with other youth, the two decided to organize a sit-in at Dockum Drugstore, a popular eatery with a soda fountain. Walters remembers standing in line near the lunch counter.
I was a first-year student at Wichita University, and I had graduated from East High School and was working downtown. And I noticed, this was my first downtown job, I noticed that blacks could not eat in restaurants downtown. Many of my elders, with them, I stood in these long lines behind these boards at the end of the lunch counter in some of the restaurants. And that board was for people to queue up for carryout. And it was the only place that black Americans could get something, from these establishments because they could not sit down in them and eat.
And when you were served anything, it was in disposable containers.
Carol Parks Hahn.
And we never knew what it was to just sit there and have a glass and dishes and so forth and plates.
So that was demeaning, I thought. For whites who obviously wanted to get some food quick and go on, of course, it wasn't a problem. But for blacks, that was the only option they had.
Now, this is the kind of feeling you have when you're supposedly having a leisurely lunch and enjoying a chat with a coworker, perhaps someone you might consider a friend, but the inequities are so profound that it just couldn't be tolerated anymore. Not only for us, but for the people we loved and were close to us who worked downtown and were made to stand and face this kind of humiliation. It just had to stop.
I was angry about that, wanted to do something. Talked to my cousin Carol, became president of the Youth Council of the NAACP, attended a lot of meetings at her house. She's my cousin, and so I went to her house as a normal course of things. But her house became a kind of laboratory for me in the civil rights movement because Chet Lewis came through and her mother Vivian was secretary-treasurer, and the family was imbued in this, and that was really a very important turning point in my own life.
My mother brought a lot of national figures to Wichita. Some of them were Rosa Parks, Mamie Bradley, Emmett Till's mother. And these women were in my living room, stayed in our home. Roy Wilkins stayed in our home. So we were exposed to all of these people who influenced us and encouraged us and motivated us. So here you have this kind of motivation to say we need to keep going.
And that motivation helped the teenagers organize the sit-in. Not only NAACP leader Roy Wilkins, but Parks Hahn says she also remembers an attorney who was the West Coast Regional Secretary for the Civil Rights Organization visiting her home.
His name is Franklin Williams from California, San Francisco. He was with the NAACP, and he was at our home because my mother was so involved with the NAACP on the national level. And he was just talking casually about what the young people there were doing, and they were talking about there were barriers there in California, and they were saying, well, what about people further east of us? How could they maybe do some sitting in or something? That was the term he used. I said, sitting in? And I picked up on that, and I said, well, how nice. Maybe we could do something like that because we are just perfect. We have nothing to prohibit us from going and sitting. We are within the law to sit and expect to be served. And so we just took this idea to the Youth Council, and they carried it on.
We will not bow down to racism. Yeah, we will not bow down to injustice. We will not bow down to exploitation. What you gonna do? I'm gonna stand. I'm gonna stand. I'm gonna stand. I'm gonna stand. I'm gonna stand.
Prentice Lewis decided to stand. As a teenager in 1958, he too joined the NAACP Youth Council after facing discrimination at various restaurants downtown.
There are issues that we're discussing and dealing with, and then comes a time for some kind of action. And the sit-in then was that action that took place following discussions and debates about what's going on, how we're being treated, and what we can do about it.
Joan Williams also became active in the campaign. During her teen years, she worked at the Model clothing store in downtown Wichita. Williams decided to get involved in the sit-in after running an errand for her boss at Dockum drugstore.
It wasn't anything out of the ordinary for the owner to come and say, you go down to Dockums and pick up me a so-and-so. And I would go and I would think, well, I could get me a Coke while I'm here, but I never could. So instead of getting it to go, I wouldn't purchase it.
Galen Vesey says he knew, along with the other teenagers, the time had come to make a difference.
We cared about one another. So it was just, to me, it was just the right thing to do. We were loved, we were nurtured, we were mentored, and we knew that our parents who lined up outside of Dockum waiting for East Kellogg and College Hill to go to work to clean those white homes and prepare food were being disrespected because they couldn't have gone in while they were waiting for the bus to come to get a cup of coffee. We noticed all of that. We were taught to be observant.
Vesey says blacks frequently purchased items from Dockum drugstore, but just weren't allowed to sit and eat. Parks Hahn says they realized things had to change.
We needed to experience more fully what it was like as teenagers living in Wichita. We knew there were barriers to some of the experiences we needed to have. We need to be able to go into a drugstore, have a hamburger and a Coke, have casual conversation, smile to the people next to us, have real community with each other. So this was something we as a group decided we needed to pursue.
Ron Walters.
And so in the spring of 1958, we planned to do something about the fact that blacks couldn't eat downtown. And Wichita was tightly segregated. Most people don't understand. It was like Mississippi up north. So we tried to break it down, and we deliberately chose Dockum because Dockum was a part of a chain, the Rexall drugstore chain. And we felt that we could do something there in the heart of town that it might have a consequence.
Ain't gonna let segregation on it. Turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let segregation on it. Turn me round and keep on walking, yeah, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land.
So the teenagers began to practice. Kill Parks Hahn.
We were primed. We rehearsed everything to do, and we knew that when we went to Dockums, we were to sit facing forward, had no conversation with each other, no reading, nothing. We didn't want to give the impression that we were there for any other reason than to be served, and that's how we behaved.
We had rehearsals at St. Peter Claver Church.
Ron Walters.
And Carol arranged for that because her family went there. And so we went down in the basement, and we used a manual that eventually came out of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and its confrontations. But we really rehearsed. I mean, what would you do if you're sitting on a stool and somebody came and they spit at you or they hit you or so forth? We used nonviolent resistance. We were dedicated to doing that because we thought if an incident broke out, we didn't know how to handle it, that would devalue our cause. And so I'm glad we did because we were faced with a couple of those incidents. And the discipline that we had instilled in preparing for it really sort of brought us through those. And so we started to sit in, and we sat in for weeks, 3 or 4 weeks. First, small testing sessions where we would go in for an hour, sit down, and then we expanded as more people became aware of what was happening and volunteered.
The teenagers purposely wore their dress-up clothes for the sit-in. Joan Williams says their appearance, along with the ability to stay focused, was important.
You had to be dressed appropriately, and you had to look the part. And then you had to ask if you could order. There was a procedure, what you had to do. And then after that, after they wouldn't serve you, you just had to sit there. So while you were sitting there, all of these people were walking behind you, and you just wanted to make sure no one hit you in your back or pushed you where you'd hit the counter or anything. So That's what you thought about. That's what I thought about.
On the very first day of the sit-in, in the summer of 1958, Carol Parks Hahn got in her yellow Chevy and drove downtown.
I parked and I walked about 2 or 3 blocks to Dockums. And I remember it very vividly. It was a beautiful day. And I walked in. I was the very first one to show up. And I sat down. And there were no incidents at the time. The waitresses were very nice and pleasant until they realized that we were a group of African American youth coming in to be served. And of course, they had instructions to not serve us.
I spoke with Carol Parks Hahn in 2008. We walked back to the site of Dockum Drugstore. The site is now the Ambassador Hotel, but then it was an empty building. And when you think back on that day, this is literally where you stood.
Yes, this is where I stood.
At the corner of Douglas and Broadway.
Uh-huh, that's right. And we were all coming from different directions. We did not come as a group. We came individually. This is the entrance. This would have been the entrance to Dockum Drugstore. And there was a door here. We'd open the door and enter. The counter was against the west wall. I entered and sat on the center stool and faced the west wall.
So you went in and you sat on the middle stool, and so what happened?
Well, she came up to me and I ordered a Coke, not thinking she would serve me, and she gave it to me, and I said, oh my. And then the others came in and they sat, and she looked at them and she looked at me. And she leaned forward and she said, you're not colored, are you, dear? And I said, oh, yes, I am. And then she pulled away, she pulled back, because the store policy was not to serve colored people, as we were called at that time. And that was the last time she spoke to us. All communication stopped at that time.
So had you drank the Coke at all or anything?
Yes, I was ready to order another one. But when she found out who I was, then everything changed.
We who believe in freedom cannot rest. Sing it with us, come on. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. To me, young people come first. They come first. They have the courage where we fail. And if I can but shed some light as they carry us through the gate, we who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. The older I get, the better I know that the secret of my going on is when the reins are in the hands of the young who dare to run against the storm. We who believe in freedom.
I think one of the things that's very important for us to remember is that this had not happened before.
Dr. Gretchen Ike, author of Dissent in Wichita, the Civil Rights Movement in the Midwest.
There had been attempted sit-ins, lots of attempted sit-ins, way back from the 1940s. But there had never been a sustained student-led sit-in that had been maintained for 3 weeks and that was able to persuade the powers over that controlled the drugstore chain that they were losing too much money from the students' very polite protest and sustained protest, and that we're able to persuade that drugstore chain to instead desegregate all of the drugstores in the state of Kansas. That set a precedent. That was really significant. It would take many years to get all of the convenience stores, all of the, like the equivalent of Target and Walmart today, to follow suit. But it was the drugstores in the Midwest and here in Wichita, Kansas, that really began what would be a very significant strategy, a strategy that would change America, would change the way business was done in the United States.
And this change did not come without some anxious moments. Parks Hahn said she was glad that the youth group's mentor, Chester Lewis Jr., was just a phone call away. Lewis was a prominent lawyer who gave the students free legal advice and also president of the Wichita chapter of the NAACP. Parks Hahn remembers nervously sitting at Dockum lunch counter one day when police officers paid a visit.
They just came in the door, and I didn't know where they went, and so I turned around, and they were standing behind me. And I said, well, and I looked at them, and I realized that this was not, a friendly visit. So I carefully climbed off the stool and went over to the phone, and I called Chester Lewis. And he said, tell everybody to go home, and that's what we did.
What was the officer doing?
Looking at me. He had a billy club in his hand, and he was, kind of moving it back and forth. Didn't say anything to me. And looking at me as if, letting me know that I'm here in case you do anything that you shouldn't do. And, of course, we weren't doing anything we shouldn't do. So nothing, as I said, nothing was said to any of us. And
how did that make you feel at the time?
Well, I've never felt anything quite like that. It was, it made you feel uneasy. And we knew some things were going to happen. And so when I called Chester and he said, come home, that's exactly what we did.
And that wasn't the only time the students felt uneasy. Walter says he remembers sitting at the lunch counter once when a motorcycle gang came into Dockum drugstore.
Well, it was mixed men and women, some motorcycle, black jackets and so forth. They filled up the Dockum drugstore while we were sitting there one day. And there must have been 8, 10 of them come in, and somebody said, well, wait till the rest of our group gets here. And I said, my goodness. So I jumped off the stool and called the police. And this was a very interesting discussion because I said to him, I described what was happening, and he said, well, he says, have they done anything? This is the police chief. I said, well, are you going to wait until they injure us or tear up the store before you come here? And he said something I've always puzzled me. He said, I have been told to keep my hands off of this. And I wondered, by whom? In any case, I was despondent because I hung up the phone and sat back down at the lunch counter. And it was not long before he showed up with two other deputies. And he looked around, and this group then started to move off. It's a good thing they did, because I had also called 9th Street and Turner Drugstore and told some of the people there that we were in trouble. So after this gang left, 3 or 4 carloads of black fellas pulled up outside of the drugstore. And so sometimes I think about, I may not be sitting here if they had met each other, that would have been unfortunate. But at that point, I had no faith that the police would protect us. And the only protection I think we had was for them to get here quickly.
Despite outside interference, Walter said the teenagers had to remain in a state of readiness.
We had to keep those seats occupied because if we were going to cost the establishment money, it meant that we had to be there on those stools. Sometimes we were not able to fill all the stools up. And someone came in, maybe the person was white, and they looked and they started toward an empty stool. Then they realized what was going on. And they backed away. A lot of them backed away. And in other words, their backing away meant that they participated in the boycott. Some came in, looked at what was happening, cursed us out. And because they understood then that we were depriving them of this service. So we had different kind of reactions.
Carol Parks Hahn.
It was an ongoing state of mind. And we had to be prepared. We didn't know we were going to be called to come in tomorrow or when, but we had to be prepared to do what we were doing. So relaxation wasn't there for us at this time, but it was worth every effort we put into it.
After weeks of the sit-in, Parks Hahn says, the day came when the owner would finally make a change.
He came to the door, and he looked directly back, not at us, but he looked to the back of the store, to his manager, and he said, "Serve them, I'm losing too much money," and then he left. It was that simple. And the waitresses were relieved. We were all relieved. And they served us, and we ate, and then we left and went home.
Walter says Chester Lewis called to tell him the good news.
The management came out and said, "All right, you've cost us a lot of money, and this is over. I'll serve all people, regardless of race." So Carol was there. I was not there. I was doing military training on the weekend in Colorado, and Chet called me and let me know that they had reached an agreement, that he was the one who went and negotiated the agreement with the administration of the store, and called a press conference and made the announcement. This was very important because it had a ripple effect. The Youth Council in Oklahoma City took up the boycott, and they did it all year in 1959. Now, I'm talking about before Greensboro in 1960. So these things actually led into Greensboro because we were the same students. We were all members of the NAACP Youth Council.
Dr. Gretchen Ike.
The Wichita sit-in was especially significant in that it succeeded in desegregating the largest drugstore chain in Kansas in 1958, 18 months, almost 2 years before sit-ins began to sweep across the South. That's significant because segregation was practiced in the Midwest and elsewhere in the United States, and we forget that and tend to think that segregation was a Southern phenomenon. It was a national phenomenon, and by the same token, the civil rights movement was a national phenomenon. Dr. King actually commended the students from Wichita and the students who later sat in right after the Wichita sit-in in Oklahoma City, and made a speech in which he said that these students really were responsible for developing a strategy that would spread and change the nation. And it happened here in Wichita, Kansas, in the heart of the Midwest.
The Dockum drugstore sit-in never achieved national visibility for a variety of reasons. The local newspaper did not want to contend with disgruntled business advertisers. The national NAACP did not sanction sit-ins at the time, but later acknowledged the Wichita protest. A year and a half later, students would erupt across the South and attract media attention. Ron Walters.
The problem was that the media covered the story of the sit-ins in 1960 as a Southern story. They didn't cover what happened in Kansas and Oklahoma because it wasn't the dramatic South. So it had the effect of actually divorcing us from the rest of the movement. And happily today, the NAACP restored us to the rest of the movement.
How did I make it over? You know my soul, look back and wonder, how did I make it over?
You came back to Wichita. Did you go to Dockum drugstore?
I did. It was the first stop. I couldn't wait to get to Dockum drugstore, sit down in a stool, order something to eat, and watch the reaction. And obviously the reaction was diffident. What I mean by that is that I got my food, but I got it in a very peculiar, backhanded way. And I said, that's fine, because this will wear off. The fact is, I'm sitting here, I'm eating, I've paid for my food, and I'm gone. So I think that lunch counter, the fact that lunch counter has been memorialized to some extent in downtown Wichita is really a tribute to what it was that we went through, because it really symbolizes freedom and independence and equality.
Falling and rising, all of these years, you know my soul.
60 years after the Dockum sit-in, Carol Parks Hahn places her black napkin on her lap at a fine dining restaurant inside the Ambassador Hotel. It was built at the same location where she once was refused service. I'm just curious, how does it feel to sit here now?
I don't feel as though I'm in Wichita, actually, because this is the first time I've even attempted to go back into this building since 1958. And but this is having a leisurely lunch here with you is a new experience, and it's hope for the future for us and our descendants and all the people who are going to become Wichitans. Wichita is growing by leaps and bounds, and I can see a real fine future for us here.
In July 2006, at the insistence of the Wichita chapter, the National NAACP recognized the Wichita campaign as the first sit-in that led to widespread change. On January 10, 2007, the Wichita City Council officially renamed the park on Douglas near Broadway the Chester I. Lewis Reflection Square Park, the place where the replica of the lunch counter is located. Dr. Ron Walters died in 2010. All other Dockum sit-in participants in the story, Carol Parks Hahn, Prentice Lewis, Joan Williams, and Dr. Galen Vesey, are still here in Wichita. For KMUW News, I'm Carla Eckels.
Tell me how I got over, falling and rising, all of these years. You know my soul, look back and wonder, how did I make it over?